ahead and just do a short intro. So my name is Ginevra, and I am the program coordinator / director at Sustainable Woodstock. Welcome to Green Drinks. This is our monthly Green Drinks for June, but it's a monthly series. So Green Drinks are social events that connect people with similar interests. We invite local nonprofits, businesses, individuals to make short presentations that highlight sustainability and green initiatives in our area. So you have come to our June Green Drinks on invasive species. We are Sustainable Woodstock. We are founded in 2009, and we're a nonprofit community and environmental action and education organization building on Woodstock's legacy as the birthplace of the modern conservation movement. Our vision promotes vibrant, inclusive, thriving communities where we live sustainably now and into the future. So I'm going to do a brief plug for our July Green Drinks. It'll be on July 21st and is going to be about our new regional climate action plan. So climate action plans are roadmaps outlining steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We will be joined by Jeff Martin. He's the Intermunicipal Regional Energy Coordinator at Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Commission to learn more about that regional climate plan. It was developed in collaboration with Woodstock, Sharon, Stratford, Thetford, Norwich, and Bradford. So those are the towns that it will cover and focus on. All right, before we get started tonight, I'm just going to quickly run through the agenda and how our meeting will operate. We are recording. I'm going to double check. Yes, we are. So I'm going to send out a recording of this event to everyone who registered. So don't worry if you have to leave early. And anyone who misses it will get to watch the recording. Right now, you should be currently muted. And if you do have questions throughout the presentation, it would be great if you could type them in the chat box. If you're unfamiliar with Zoom, just, at least on the computer version, just run your cursor over the screen. And there is a black bar that pops up at the bottom. There's a chat option there. If you don't see it, hit the ... more button, and there's a chat option there. So that's how you can access your chat. And we'll save your questions for the Q&A section at the end. Okay, I think those are kind of the basics. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenter tonight. We're going to hear from Lina Swislocki. Lina has a master's degree in education and spent nearly a decade teaching kids outside. She stumbled into invasive plant management while living and working in New Zealand and hasn't looked back since. Lina has been with the Vermont Forest, Parks, and Recreation's invasive plant program since 2018, first as field crew and now as assistant coordinator. When she's not working on or thinking about invasive plants, she likes to learn things and make things, and thinks everything is more fun outdoors, which it definitely is. So I think I will stop now. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Lina. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Can you just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me okay? Fantastic. And I am going to share my screen. I think it's this one. Yep. Cool. And we'll get started. So as Ginevra said, my name is Lina Swislocki. I'm the Invasive Plant Assistant Coordinator for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And one of my favorite things to do outside is to find unusually sized invasive plants. And so here in this photo, I'm
we
standing.
Don't see your screen, Lina.
Oh no! Let me try
Panic.
that again. Ah!
Yeah.
Hang on. I said share screen, and I want to share this one. And it's highlighting, but that screen is shared. And I want it to show a slideshow.
If it doesn't work, you can email it to me and I can show it, but it should work.
Yeah. Share.
Something's okay. There we go. Got it.
Awesome. Okay. We'll start over again. So as I was saying, my name is Lina Swislocki. I am the assistant coordinator of the invasive plant program for the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. And in this photo, I'm making a goofy face behind a garlic mustard that is almost as tall as I am. And I'm 5'5" for the record. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about what invasive plants are and how they impact us here in Vermont, and a little bit about what we can do about them. I'll also cover some basic methods for IDing plants. We'll do a little bit of practice. I'll share some resources that you have access to, and I will suggest some ways that you can get involved. And after that, we'll have time for questions. So let's get started. It is not changing my slide. Stand by 1 second. Sorry, everybody.
Is it being funky?
I'm going to try this one more time, and if it doesn't work, I'll send you my.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, should work now. Can you see what can you see this?
The first slide, yeah.
Great. Can you see the second slide?
Presidential documents?
That's the one. Cool. And so thank you for bearing with me. I appreciate it. This slide might look like it has a lot of words, and I know that that's really bad PowerPoint form, but it's actually just a picture of a lot of words, and you don't have to read the whole thing. So I'm pretty sure that makes it okay. This is an image of a presidential document. It's Executive Order 13112, signed by then President Clinton on February 3rd, 1999. And it's useful for us because right here in section 1F, it defines what invasive species are. And this is the definition that we use when we're talking about invasive plants in Vermont, with a couple of word choice changes to reflect some of the progress that we've made in the last 23 years. But an invasive plant is a plant that evolved somewhere else, whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic, environmental, or human harm. So we will talk a little bit about economic, environmental, and human harms caused by invasive plants. One uniquely Vermont economic sector that's at risk from invasives is our beloved sugar bush, as evidenced here in this picture of a sugar bush. Invasive plants like honeysuckle quickly overtake the understory, and when they do, they shade out sugar maple saplings, which reduces future generations of trees and endangers the longevity of sugaring, which is terrible news for anybody who sells maple syrup. And it's also terrible news for me because I love maple syrup. So my life would certainly be poorer without it, money aside. An environmental risk that is pictured here is the West Virginia white butterfly, which despite its name actually relies on Vermont woodlands as part of its habitat. But that habitat is at risk of being overrun by garlic mustard, which is toxic to these tiny little butterflies, and their declining numbers reflect that impact. And of course, the real risk to human health, maple syrup jokes aside, is represented by everybody's favorite, that yellow flower on the white, wild parsnip. This plant has toxins in its sap that, if the sap gets onto your skin and your skin gets exposed to sunlight, can cause phytophotodermatitis, which is a very painful chemical burn. I've had it, and it stinks. So this is an example of an invasion curve, a graphic of an invasion curve. When we talk about invasive plants, we talk about invasions or infestations. Because these plants didn't evolve here, they arrived here. And when they do, their numbers grow. But those numbers don't necessarily grow linearly, and management options vary depending on where in the invasion curve we are. So there are some EDRR plants, early detection rapid response, and there are projects that we're working on with those to try to limit the number of new invasive species that enter our ecosystems. But most of the plants we're going to talk about today are pretty common, and they're towards the right side of this graphic. Local management is often our only option, and complete eradication is likely impossible and is hard and expensive. So why should we even bother? What are we going to do about it? I'll give you a hint. Not this. Pretending that nothing is happening or that everything is fine is not actually going to solve any problems. Invasive plant management is challenging and important work, and it's not going to do itself. So as people who care about the economy, the ecosystems, and the human health of our surroundings, we have to do the work to manage invasive plants. And of course, being able to manage invasive plants starts with being able to recognize them. Identifying plants in the field is all about looking for clues to their identity. Plants have a limited number of characteristics that we can look at. They've got leaves and bark and flowers. So we have to be attuned to subtle differences to determine which plants we're looking at when. When I'm IDing plants, I usually start by looking at the leaves. How are they arranged on the branch? What shape are they? What color are they? What do they look like? What do they feel like? There are absolutely fancy botany terms for all of these, and maybe this is because I was a teacher for so long, I find that exploring and explaining plants the way you would to a child is actually the easiest way to communicate what you're thinking about. So you'll see we use words like round or egg-shaped. We talk about plants being opposite from each other or alternate. They can be hairy or smooth. The edges can be jagged or lobed or smooth. Those kinds of words are really useful when talking about plants. There are more clues that can be found in other parts of the plants. So you can look at the bark. Is it bumpy? Is it smooth? What color is it? Buckthorn on the top left has those white dots called lenticels, and Japanese lilac on the bottom left has a really peeling bark. The inside of plants has a lot of clues. The layer of plants immediately beneath the bark is called the cambium, and the cambium in some plants can be different colors. So in the middle on the bottom, there are 2 buckthorns and a cherry, and you can see how the 2 buckthorns, which are the ones on either side, are sort of orange and greenish in the cambium. And above that is a picture of a honeysuckle, and the inside of the honeysuckle is called a pith. Invasive honeysuckles are hollow in the middle, which is interesting because it's not true of our locally evolved honeysuckles. So looking under the bark is another interesting way to find clues about what invasive plants you're looking at. And then there's what I call the extras, the flowers, the fruits, the thorns, and those colors and arrangement and size can all sort of help you really fine tune which plants you're looking at. So in this case, the top one is honeysuckle and the bottom one is barberry. So let's give it a try. Here are 3 pictures. We've got leaves, we've got bark, and we've got extras. And I was hoping that people would type into the chat some of the things that you notice that might be helpful in determining what plant this is. I see alternate leaves. Oh my gosh. The veins, the leaf structure, yeah, absolutely. Those are the first thing that I would look at with this plant also, egg-shaped to round. Somebody notices a thorn, which is a very important clue. Some lobed leaves, rough bark. Yeah, so what I would notice here, it's excellent. So we've got alternate leaves. The veins in this plant are really unusual. They're like U-shaped and concentric, and they all, if you look closely, they all kind of curve around and point towards the tip instead of going out to the sides. And the edges of the leaves are jagged or toothed. And somebody pointed this out in the chat too, they're alternate. So they're like this, not like this. This plant sometimes can get a little confusing, but if you look closely, they're not like, equally spaced, but they aren't immediately across from each other. Somebody in the chat also pointed out the cambium, excuse me, and the rough bark. And of course, that thorn, which is not technically a thorn, it's a pseudo thorn, it's a modified branch. But believe me, when it gets under your skin, you cannot tell the difference. So as you all guessed, it's buckthorn. Yay. Nicely done. We're going to try 2 more times. So let's do it again. Leaves, extras, and bark. If you want to put in the chat what you see, and let me know what you think this is, please feel free. All right, Teresa's coming through with a guess. The hollow pith. Everybody agrees. Yeah, absolutely. The hollow stem, it's an invasive honeysuckle. totally gave it away before. But if you were going to pretend that you didn't know what this was already, you might start by looking at the leaves. They're opposite from each other. They're fuzzy. I know you can't feel that in a photo, but they are. It's a different shade of green from the buckthorn that we saw in the last image. And they're sort of egg-shaped. They've got smooth edges. If you look at the pith, it's hollow, which is unusual and always kind of a treat to find. And the exterior bark tends to be sort of gray or khaki colored and can get pretty textured as the plant gets older. And one interesting thing about this plant, I think, is that the flowers and the fruits always grow in pairs. And here this one is white. And then as the flowers die back, they turn to yellow, which helps us identify which particular species of invasive honeysuckle that is. So you got it, honeysuckle. And Eleanor's saying in the chat that the green leaves come out earlier than most things. That's true. Honeysuckle, certainly, it's actually a pretty common adaptation in a lot of invasive species. And I think it's one of the things that tends to give them a leg up over locally evolved species, because they have longer to photosynthesize, they have longer to make and store energy. And if they get their leaves before the locally evolved plants do, they can shade out some of their competition. So honeysuckle absolutely leaves out early, and buckthorn, I think, tends to keep its leaves pretty late. So we'll go on to our last plant. Any guesses? What could it be? We've got bright green, smooth, deeply lobed leaves, a nice smooth stem, not a hair in sight. Yellow flowers arranged in an umbrella shape. I see a few guesses in the chat, and many of you are right. It is wild parsnip. Wild parsnip is related. I saw some people guessing hemlock and hogweed. Parsnip and hemlock and hogweed are all related to each other. They're all in the carrot family, as is celery and garden parsnip, which is, and Kim Bartlett asked if the flowers can be white. Queen Anne's lace flowers can be white. Angelica flowers can be white. Nell is asking about the Queen Anne's lace like plant that's crowding out lupin, and Colleen is right. That is chervil. Chervil is also related to this family. Cow parsnip flowers are white. Yeah, there are a lot of plants in this family. Many of them have that, oh, I forget the name of the chemical, but whatever it is that causes the phytophotodermatitis in it. So if you're going to be handling these, do it carefully. But yes, this particular one is wild parsnip. And so I'm going to minimize the chat for a little bit. We'll come back to you guys. And moving on. Oh, so that's kind of the formula that I go through when I'm learning how to ID plants, right? You look at the leaves, you look at the stems, you look at the flowers, and sort of figure out some identifying characteristics for each plant. But it does take practice. And so we created this, which is a PDF guide of 12 invasive plants commonly found in Vermont. It's available for free to download on our website, which I will provide for you in one moment. And we formatted it so that you can print it and fold it and put it in your pocket and take it with you if you're heading out and you want to be able to ID invasive plants. Or if you're like me and in college and want to stick it under your pillow and try to learn by osmosis, you're welcome to try that too. It didn't work for me when I was in school, but maybe you'll have better luck. So this is available for you for free, as I said, on our website, which is here, vtinvasives.org. And there's a ton of stuff available here. If you know sort of what you're looking for, up here in the top right, we have a search bar. So you can put in your search terms there and it will bring up anything on the website that pertains to that. If you just kind of want to peruse some pictures of invasive plants and insects, we've got them divided into land and aquatic right there. And if you want more information specifically about the invasive plant program, if you click About Us, we are one of the options in the drop-down menu, so you can check that out. And then now you've done some learning, you want to get involved and make a difference. So we've got a couple options. We have in our office in Essex Junction a tool lending library where we have saws, pickaxes, these awesome uprooters that I love. It's all available to borrow for free. All you need to do is get in touch with me and we can arrange a time to meet. But I know that most of you are probably far from Essex Junction. And if you don't feel like driving all that way, often local groups like libraries or conservation commissions will have these tools available for borrowing. So I would recommend looking into that. And we also have a number of phenology monitoring projects going on right now. Phenology is life stage changes of living things. There is currently no formal phenology data for invasive plants in Vermont, so we are undertaking researching that. And we're always looking for more volunteers to help us. So that is that. Thank you. Here are some useful links. The top one is for volunteer opportunities if you want to help with any of our phenology projects. The middle one is my email address, and the bottom one is our website. And I will happily open to questions.
Thanks so much, Lina. This is great because we've got a ton of time for questions, and I think folks have come to this presentation with some grievances about specific plants and some questions.
I know the feeling.
Plants. Yeah, I had a feeling too. So I'm just gonna start here from the beginning, and please feel free to keep entering questions, folks. Rebecca's curious about the best way to rid our forests of grapevine. Is autumn the best time to cut them down?
So grapevine is actually not technically an invasive plant because it did evolve in this ecosystem. We often consider it a pest plant rather than invasive. And so if it's in your way, cut it down, but it's not something that I have a lot of experience dealing with directly.
Thank you. And this is coming up a lot. Some folks, I mean, you partially answered it, but the white, smaller, 3-foot high parsnip / hemlock growing everywhere with the umbrellas full of gazillions of seeds. We dig it up, cut it, tarp it. What's our chance? Thank you. Also throwing some of the corn powder that is supposed to inhibit weed germination. More ideas? Thanks.
Interesting. I don't know anything about corn powder, but I'm imagining that the plant that this person is asking about is chervil, wild chervil. And chervil, like most of the other plants in the carrot family, tends to have a 2-year life cycle. So in the first year, it sends up these little rosettes, and it photosynthesizes for a year, and it collects all of these nutrients and stores them all in this giant taproot. And chervil taproots can be enormous. And then it overwinters as a rosette. There's actually quite a bit of seedling die-off at that stage. And then the following spring, the ones that survive will bolt and send up the flowers like the ones that you're seeing right now. And those form into seeds. And then those seeds drop and have a huge viability success rate. So that's how the plant spreads. So the best way to tend to chervil is to keep it from going to seed, or to keep the seeds out of your ecosystem however you can. What I have found is that if you can catch it in between when it makes the flower and when the flower proceeds to seed, you can pull it out of the ground the most easily at that phase. It's actually, I think it's really cool. The energy that it takes for the plant to produce the flower physically shrinks the taproot just enough that it gets a little bit looser in the soil and it becomes easier to pull out, which I just think is bananas. So if you can pull it out at that phase, that's great. If you cannot get to it at that phase, you can try cutting the flower heads off directly into a trash bag. And that way it prevents them from going to seed in your ecosystem. You can mow it repeatedly, but you have to do it every few weeks because it will flower again. You can try mowing it and covering it with black plastic, depending on what size area you're working with, and smothering it in that way. I want to say that the seeds persist in the system for like 2 years. I don't think that they're very long lived once it does go to seed. So once you get started, it's hard because it spreads so easily. But I do think that with persistence, it is probably doable. But I just wanted to add to that. I know a couple people mentioned in the chat, and I have noticed too, that it's spreading a lot down roadsides. And often what happens unintentionally is that as people mow, seeds get stuck in equipment. And so if you're mowing from a place where there is a plant like chervil or parsnip spreads in the same way to a place where it isn't, you can drag seed with you. And so a better strategy, if you're trying to deal with this on your own property, is to mow from where there isn't this invasive plant towards where there is. And that way you can kind of contain the seed into an area that's already been infested.
Yeah, thank you. And that was the next question, related to the role of highway and town roads in spreading. And this person also mentions Japanese knotweed.
Yeah, Japanese knotweed is a cool plant. I have to like admire these adaptations of these plants because otherwise it's just really too depressing to think about. But is there, Ginevra, is there a specific question about knotweed or just an observation that it spreads?
An observation it spreads, and I guess just how do you address town road crews and highway crews spreading it?
Yeah. So knotweed is tough because it has a much longer life cycle than chervil. This is actually one of the reasons I think the phenology is so interesting, because understanding the life cycles of these plants helps figure out how to treat them. And Japanese knotweed can regrow from very, very small amounts of stem material. So mowing can actually spread it because, or like if you're imagining weed whacking and there's tiny little bits of plant flying all over the place, and if any of those have nodes, they can actually potentially reroot and spread that way. So the same thing would probably apply there in terms of like tending to your property or your road from a place that isn't infested to a place that is. One way that we have treated knotweed on state lands is to cut it down and then with a literal eyedropper drip herbicides into the hollow stems, which then translocates directly to that plant root and minimizes the amount of herbicide that's like getting into the rest of the ecosystem. So, and even with that, it takes a few years. These plants have really intense root and rhizome systems under the ground. And so knocking it back, and eventually exhausting that rhizome is what you're trying to do. And you can try smothering it. We successfully smothered, actually, no, I take that back. We didn't smother knotweed, we smothered Phragmites, which is a similar life cycle. But yeah, just trying to keep it going, managing from an uninfested place to an infested place, or knocking it back from a place that's very special or important, like keeping it away from a river's edge, keeping it away from the foundation of your home. Sort of figuring out how to prioritize an infestation in that way, I think is a big part of managing for knotweed.
Yeah, that's a big one. Thank you. Phyllis asks, once you have removed an invasive species, what is the best way to dispose of it?
That's a great question, Phyllis. And it really depends on where you are and what kind of species you're talking about. For woody invasives, so anything that has like a hard bark on the outside, what we'll usually do is hang it upside down from a nearby tree, which dries it out. And that way, any seeds that might be forming on the plant will drop into a place that's already been infested. And after the plant dries out and dies and starts to biodegrade, all of those nutrients that it's absorbed from that soil will re-enter that same ecosystem and sort of keep them in place. For herbaceous species like parsnip or knotweed, it sort of depends. Parsnip and knotweed are both really like tough. And so what we usually will try to do is bag them into black plastic and then leave those bags in the sun and let them rot in the bag. And then you contact your solid waste management district to see how they want you to deal with them. Some of them, if the compost gets hot enough, are willing to compost it. Some of them want you to put it in the landfill. That is a sort of a district by district choice that they have asked us to direct you to them to help make. So with plants like garlic mustard that are soft and you're able to bag them without ripping the bag, I bag them, I leave that bag in the sun, I contact my solid waste district. With plants like knotweed or parsnip, where the stalk is really stiff, and if you try to bag it, it will rip the bag, I pile them up on top of black plastic and let it kind of rot and dry out in the sun. And monitor that because they can actually resprout from the carcasses of their friends, which is kind of weird. But sort of keeping everything contained and trying to make sure that the plant is totally denatured before you bury it or bag it up and throw it away.
Great, thank you. Next question is there much hybridization between native species and invasives?
That is a good question. The only one that I can think of off the top of my head is bittersweet. There's an Asiatic bittersweet and an American bittersweet, and they are hybridizing, and we're losing the genetic, like, I don't know, purity, for want of a better word, of the American bittersweet, which I don't know. In that particular case, I'm not so certain that it's a real problem. And I know that invasive honeysuckles will hybridize with each other, but I don't think that they hybridize with the locally evolved ones. So there's a little bit, but not a ton.
I didn't know we had a native bittersweet.
Yeah. You can tell. Oh shoot, this is one of those things I would have to look up in our handy guide. One of them flowers only at the end, and one of them flowers all along the branch.
Okay. We're going back to chervil just because this question has a second part that I don't think we addressed, which is there a long-term plan to deal with the wild chervil exploding and spreading from roadside mowing?
That is a really great question. And it's one of the things that I forgot to mention in my technical snafu at the beginning. But there is actually no statewide invasive plant entity. I am half of the state invasive plant program. That's just the two of us. And we manage invasive plants on state-owned lands. But in terms of roads or working with landowners, there isn't any single leader in that. So I don't think that there is a long-term plan for dealing with chervil on roadsides. I know that our program is doing a lot of work with various local roads organizations to try to help townships kind of come up with best practices to deal with their own stretches. But I don't think that there's an overarching one.
Thank you. Nathaniel asked, does Vermont Invasives use or collaborate with iNaturalist at all?
Yes, we do. One of our phenology projects, which you can find on that volunteer link, is to go through and use iNaturalist to basically establish presence or absence of invasive plants wherever you go. It's called Mapping for a Healthy Forest Vermont is the project on iNat. And so I think that's been going, I want to say since 2014. There's quite a bit of information on there, and we use it a lot for figuring out sort of where things are in the state.
So would you recommend that folks who are on this call enter locations of invasives when they see them?
Oh yeah, that would be great. That would be great. And actually, if you are interested in tracking invasives in your area, we have another phenology project that I care about because I'm in charge of it. But for the second full week of every month, volunteers just look around and email me the phenophase of whatever invasive plant you're seeing. And we organize it by county, and that goes out in a monthly report on our forest protection website. And I don't know how many people subscribe to this newsletter, but and it's a big newsletter. And then we have that information is available for land managers across the state. And unsurprisingly, most of my volunteers are in Chittenden County because that's where I am and that's where most of the people are. But I'm always looking for people to make observations outside of this county. So that also, it's called State Invasive Plant Phenology Monitoring Project, or SIPMOP. And it's also one of the links on that volunteer page. And if anybody would like to volunteer for that, I would really, really appreciate it.
I can send out the contact info or like link for that program if
that'd
you
be awesome,
Lina, in a follow-up email for folks. Yeah,
you got it.
Because that might relate to the next question from Kate. Barnard's entire roadsides are not chervil. I'm assuming you mean knotweed and chervil, goutweed and garlic mustard. What does one do?
The cynic in me says move, but the environmental steward in me says to work with your town, work with your conservation commission, work with your local roads. You said knotweed, chervil, garlic mustard, and I forget the other one.
Goutweed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's not, that's like a quadfecta of some pretty aggressive invasive plants. And there isn't a single right answer for how to deal with those. I think that trying to minimize the spread and noticing like, okay, by the side of the road is maybe we just have to accept that like that's going to have invasive plants alongside it. But if we can keep the plants from marching into the fields or marching into the forest and sort of tending to those edges and pushing the plants back to a place that's already so impacted, that would probably be my strategy in Barnard.
Thank you. Kim asks, would you please go over the definition again about what makes a plant invasive and particularly why it's related to people?
Yeah. So the three things, so what makes a plant invasive, first and foremost, did it come from somewhere else? So there can be pest plants that evolved in this area that can be dangerous and can be irritating, but they are not technically invasive because they evolved in this ecosystem. And that's important because when things evolve in an ecosystem, they evolve with sort of checks and balances. They have predators, they have diseases, they have other things that can help keep them in check. But when plants evolve somewhere else and then get moved here, they don't bring those with them. And so they are much more readily able to take over an environment than a plant that did evolve with those checks and balances. So an invasive plant evolved from somewhere else. And then in the definition provided by President Clinton, evolved somewhere else, and it has the potential to cause economic, environmental, or human harm. And I get like, does that answer the question? I don't know why human harm is included in that definition, but it is.
Well, humans made the definition, I guess.
Yeah, that tracks.
If there's another question on that, you can pop it in the chat. Thank you, Lina.
Yeah.
This is a comment, but perhaps you want to address it because we haven't talked about this species. Ellen commented that there are a lot of the invasive olive shrubs / trees. We haven't mentioned that one, but any tips?
So with fruiting trees, autumn olive, buckthorn comes to mind. If you can you have a little bit more time because trees like that take a while to get to maturity compared to like a 2-year garlic mustard or wild parsnip. And so you have a little bit more time and you can sort of wait and see which ones are going to fruit and wait and see which ones are going to survive and then attend to those. So you don't have to sit there and pull out every little tiny inch long seedling because some of those are going to die anyways. And so you don't have to spend your time doing it. That tool that I showed in one of my slides, the uprooter or the weed wrench, is a super handy tool for pulling out anything that's big and woody. It has these jaws and you put the jaw around the stem of the tree and then step on this handle and close it and then lever it out of the ground. It's like the best part of physics and they make the most satisfying pop when they just like pop right out of the soil. I love it. I will put, Ginevra, I'll include that in my email to you also, so that folks can like watch a video of it in action if you want to, but it's like, we have pulled out Yeah, we pulled out some like house-sized honeysuckles with like tiny little middle school students using these uprooters. It's just, they're so cool.
Yeah, and maybe for those listening, this is an opportunity to advocate for your town to buy one for town use.
Yeah.
Tomorrow or your library.
I think that they tend to be like $150 to $200 per, which for an individual may be unachievable, but for a township seems like it should be doable. I'm just looking for a pen so I can write down the things I'm supposed to send you. I can still hear. I'm just.
I'm unfortunately going to skip this next question because it is about grapevines, and Lina already mentioned that they aren't invasive, so she doesn't have tips for those. Kathleen's asking how do we rid our field of wild parsnips?
Great question. It sort of depends on the size of the infestation and the size of the field. Wild parsnip, like the other plants in the carrot family, does okay if you mow repeatedly. And I think it's like every 3 weeks or so during the mowing season. If you go to VT Invasives and search for wild parsnip, a treatment sheet will become available to you that will have specifics about the mowing schedule on it. If there aren't that many, you can try pulling them out by hand. Again, very satisfying pop when it comes out of the ground. I would recommend long sleeves and gloves, and also doing it at night. I think is an underutilized resource, but if you go out with a headlamp and you pull at night, parsnip blooms in the middle of July when it is hot and humid, and the last thing that you want to do is be out in the full sun in your long sleeves and gloves pulling this plant that's going to burn you if you look at it wrong. That's not true. That's an exaggeration, but burn you if you get the sap on you and then get that exposed to sun. So I think pulling it at night is a really good option if you're going to hand pull it. If your field is infested to the point that that is untenable, totally understandable, I would mow and mow repeatedly.
Great, thank you. And Dory is asking if you could describe the biennial cycle of garlic mustard, and specifically, what does the plant look like in the year before it blooms and produces seed? I don't know if you had a picture of that on the slideshow.
I didn't have a picture of that on the slideshow. I will try to describe it to you. I don't think that I can talk and Google at the same time. I'm sorry. But garlic mustard in its first year makes a small rosette. It's like maybe this tall, sort of generally about this big. The leaves tend to be pretty heart-shaped and fairly dark green. Sometimes they're confused for violet. There's like a native violet that blooms early in the spring, and its leaves and garlic mustard leaves can look a little bit similar. And yeah, in its first year, it's really, really unremarkable. And then in its second year, it bolts and the leaves elongate and become much more triangular and jagged shaped. But they do look very different between the first and second years. That will be in our 12 common invasive plants field guide. And it's also, there are tons and tons of pictures on Google if you want to look it up. I like to look at a bunch of different pictures because it never looks exactly the same, but if you can get sort of the general idea, sort of a broad search image, then I find that very helpful.
Great, thank you. This is one we haven't touched on much. Eliza says, I don't think I can eradicate my bishop's weed / gout weed, but is there a way to keep it in check?
Eliza, you are probably right. I'm sorry to say. So goutweed or bishop's weed, it's the same thing, grows primarily by stolon and rhizome, which are above and below ground stems that extend horizontally, and then the plant sends up new shoots. And so if you want to keep it contained, the best thing to do is just keep digging those out and keep pushing it back towards the main infestation. Goutweed in particular can go pretty deep. So even like putting a barrier around it, I don't think is particularly useful because it will grow underneath and then come back up on the other side. So I would just, unfortunately, I think just digging it back is going to be your best bet.
I have goutweed and I mow it back, which sort of works, but it's tough. I empathize.
Goutweed is another one of those that can resprout from small bits of stem. So if you're mowing it back, go from an uninfested place to an infested place and try to rake anything that you kick up into the goutweed, or dump your mower contents into the goutweed, so that rather than putting it in the compost or throwing it into the woods or whatever, so that if it does resprout, it resprouts in a place that's already infested.
And this person says the worst are Japanese knotweed, how to get rid of that, and goutweed. We already covered goutweed. And do you have anything to add on your comment on Japanese knotweed?
Did we talk about herbicides on knotweed yet? I don't remember.
You talked about dripping it into the open stem.
Yeah, I think that tends to be the best bet.
What season do you do that in also?
Oh, good question. Late. You do it in the fall. So it's, again, coming back to phenology, as plants are translocating nutrients from their leaves to their roots to store the energy for the dormant season. If you apply herbicide at that time, the plant will translocate the chemical along with those nutrients and it becomes much more effective. It is possible to apply a foliar spray to knotweed. I don't like to do it. I feel like I have so much more control with the clip and drip. You can try digging it out, but it's another one of those plants that has the rhizomes and it grows from tiny bits of root left behind and tiny bits of stem left behind. So if you have a new infestation or very small plants, you can try doing it. You can try cutting it back and smothering it if it's a small infestation. I would put a thick tarp over it and like extend beyond the edges of your knotweed patch, weigh it down with rocks and leave it in place for probably like 3 years. And make sure that none of the knotweed is sneaking out from the sides of the tarp. And then once you've done that, you can take the tarp up and try replanting things, over the top of where the knotweed was. But it's a challenging plant, and it's one of those ones that I would really encourage people to decide what your priority is and work towards protecting that. That's one of the hardest things that I've learned in this job, is that like, we're not going to get rid of all these invasives. They're here. And they are so well adapted to being able to take over ecosystems that it's not feasible. So you get to pick, and you get to pick what it is that you want to fight for and what it is that you want to protect. And you prioritize that. So a lot of the work that we've done has been to find like rare, threatened, and endangered species, or trails that have very little invasive presence on them, and really try to keep those safe, or plants that haven't gotten a strong foothold in Vermont yet, and try to make sure that we don't let those in. And that's sort of the way that you make a change, is by figuring out what it is that you want to protect and really working on that, as opposed to looking at like, oh my gosh, the 89 is just like chervil and parsnip the entire way. We're never going to be able to fix it. That's it. I'm not even going to try. It's not going to do anything.
Yeah, that's a good outlook. Probably I should adopt that. Someone here is asking, please say there is a way to control bed straw, which is taking over many hay fields.
Bed straw is complicated because there are a lot of locally evolved bed straws in addition to the invasive bed straws. And unfortunately, it's not one that I have a ton of experience with. So I cannot say yes, but I also will not say no. I'm not sure. Sorry.
And I can give your contact info.
Yeah, absolutely.
Follow-up email if folks want to follow up with like those specific questions.
Absolutely.
Is horsetail/mare's tail considered invasive, and can anything be done to contain it?
Oh, I don't know anything about that plant.
It's the one that is hollow and often in the near wet areas.
If it's the one that I'm thinking of, it's not invasive, and it actually has this like really cool characteristic that it is like one of the first plants to have evolved as plants were evolving. Like horsetail, it's like long stalks with nodes going up it. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah, that's like one of the oldest species of plant in the world. Not invasive. I'm all for, like, live on, man. This plant has been around for a long time.
All right. Could you please speak about spreading dog bane? I have a field full of it and wanted to have cattle graze, but I'm concerned that this plant is toxic to animals.
Oh, wow. You guys are coming with specific questions. I've not heard of dog bane either, but I'm going to minimize this and see if I can Google it.
Also, if you have questions about grazing animals, just because I live with grazing animals, UVM extension is a good place to go because they know a lot of specifics about grazing.
Yeah, UVM extension. And there's also, there are, the Agency of Agriculture oversees the noxious weed rule, and which is the rule that includes invasive plants. And so they have some insight into sort of agriculture applications that might be outside of my expertise. I'm just reading about dogbane, sorry. Native to North America, in some areas it's considered a nuisance weed. So it's not an invasive, and I hope that lets me off the hook.
I suppose it does, since this is non-invasive. Someone was commenting, there's giant Japanese knotweed in the garden of the low-rise apartment building I'm living in. How do we get rid of giant Japanese knotweed? Someone else commented about Roundup. Is Roundup something that you'd recommend folks use with like the very dripping in the hollow stem application, or not?
So Roundup is a brand name for glyphosate, which is the chemical that we tend to use on knotweed. There are specific, if you're doing a clip and drip, you're supposed to use, I think, between an 18 and 25% concentration. And I'm not sure, at the state, we have like a big jug and we mix our own concentration. So I'm not sure about how you would go about finding a pre-mixed product at the hardware store. But that is, if you go to VT Invasives and look up treatments for knotweed, that is one of the options that's listed on our treatment sheet on there. One interesting thing about knotweed, to go back to an earlier question, is that that's another plant that's hybridizing with itself. So there's giant knotweed and Japanese knotweed, and they are hybridizing into Bohemian knotweed. And that it gets into like plant genetics that I think is a little bit boring. Don't tell my boss. But because the treatment is the same and the phenology is the same, and it just sort of gets a little precise for the things that I'm interested in. To me, they're all knotweeds. But for people who are interested in plant genetics, it is cool to note that knotweeds are hybridizing with themselves, and they're all invasive.
I didn't know that. Someone is asking, could you direct us again to the PDF on your website?
Yeah. So if you go, I'm gonna navigate back through my slides really quick, and I'll try to do it slowly enough that it doesn't make anybody nauseous. Go here. Okay.
You're not going anywhere yet. We're still.
Yeah, no, I see that. Okay, I'm not gonna bother with that right now. And I'm just gonna tell you that if you go to vtinvasives.org and you type in the search bar in the top right corner, there's a little white bar with a magnifying glass in it. And if you type in knotweed into there and click enter, it will bring up a whole bunch of details about a whole bunch of articles and pages about knotweed. And one of those will have treatment information. The other thing that you can do is if you're looking at that same website, just below the search bar, there's invasives on land. There's a little button that says invasives on land. And if you click that, that will take you to a gallery of land invasives. And you can scroll through to knotweed and click on the picture of knotweed, and it will take you to the same information.
Okay, I just posted the link to the website, and now I'm going to post the link to terrestrial plants with the pictures. So you can go through and take a look and see if you see the picture that you're looking for. Okay.
Thank you.
Do you know if the new method of using a mesh ground cover has been successful with knotweed?
I have tried it, but I haven't seen for certain. So the way that this works is that the idea is that you lay down like 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch metal netting, metal mesh. It's called hardware cloth. And you cut down your knotweed almost to the ground. You lay down this mesh over the top, and theoretically the knotweed grows up through the mesh and eventually girdles itself. Because the knotweed is growing through these little metal squares, as the knotweed expands, the squares cut into the flesh of the knotweed and should kill it. I have begun a trial. I have not seen any results yet from my trial. It's too soon. I know that there are people in the UK who swear by this method, and I also know that in the UK, they won't give you a mortgage on a property that has knotweed growing near the house because it's such a problem for their foundations. So that gives me hope that it's possible, but it's too soon for me to report my own findings, and I don't know anybody in the States who's done it.
And there is someone with concerns that Roundup is highly toxic to humans, cause cancer. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, that's why I like to do the drip more than the foliar. It's super controlled. I wear a respirator, I wear gloves. But yeah, it's poison, and it's one of those prioritization things where you decide if the risk to you is how that stacks compared to the risk to the ecosystem of the knotweed being there. And there are some instances where I think it is more important to me to get the knotweed out, and there are some instances where I think it is not important enough to me to get the knotweed out. And it's a prioritization thing.
Do you mind if we have a few more questions? I know it's 6:30, but we have a couple.
That's great. I love talking about invasive plants.
Great. Susan's asking about poison ivy ideas. I tarp it, pull it, seems mowing it where it tries to expand seems to help.
Poison ivy is another one of those pest plants. It's not an invasive. It sounds like you're doing all of the right things. Maybe try digging it out. If I could recommend one thing, it would be to look up the phenology of the plant and figuring out how it spreads, and then using that as your tactic to address it. Because if it grows by stem fragments and you're mowing it, then you're just helping it out, right? But so that would be my recommendation. I think poison ivy grows by seed, or spreads by seed. So I would recommend cutting it back before it goes to seed, but look it up.
How long do the black weed filled bags need to stay in the sun before it's safe to throw it out?
Great question. We usually leave them for a few years. And I cannot tell you how gross the insides of those bags get. It's so nasty. It's like slimy and stinky, just like awful. Like when you leave the salad greens in the back of the fridge for too long, like that, but worse. So I would, if you are willing to monitor it, I would check the inside of the bag, and if they're rotted, then you're done. And if they're not rotted, then tie it back up and leave it in the sun longer. If that is gross to you, which I would totally understand, leave it for 2 or 3 years, and maybe give it a poke. And if it feels like jelly, then you're done. And if it doesn't feel like jelly, maybe leave it a little bit longer.
Do you say 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, the short answer is there is not. Yes, I did say 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
There's not a short answer to this. A lot of it is like site dependent and weather dependent and plant dependent and what stage it was when you bagged it. And I tend to be pretty conservative with that, because to me, the difference between leaving a bag at the end of my driveway for 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, it's not that big a difference to me. Once it's there, it's there. And I would rather make sure that the plant is fully decomposed before I get rid of it, instead of like chucking it too early and then contributing to the spread of invasives. But, you know, it depends.
Thank you. Kate says, thank you for your work with invasives, as we need people like you to help control this issue. Thank you.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
I don't exactly know what this question means, but I'm going to read it in case you do.
Okay.
Nell asks, I get glyphosate and how wild it is, but the eyedropper approach, ... what do you use? Do you know what that means? I'm assuming, is it what do you use? Glyphosate. What was the concentrate again, you said?
18 to 25%.
Okay.
And when it comes to herbicides, the label is the law, and it will tell you on the packaging all of the information that you need to know about how to dilute it, how to store it, how to dispose of it. And so that's, that is absolutely the first place that you start if you're wondering about how to apply an herbicide, is to read the label. And it's long and it's boring, but it's super informative, and I find it very helpful. It's like reminiscent of reading a calculus textbook, in that it's boring but informative.
That makes sense. Thank you. Susan says, poison ivy is native. Does it have any checks and balances besides me? I don't know if I know the answer to that question.
It does. I don't know about checks and balances for poison ivy in particular, but it is a food source for a lot of our animals. A lot of our animals like to eat the berries that form, which is one of, like, with invasive plants, most animals don't eat those berries. With the exception of buckthorn, which has this like really, I think, hilarious cycle with animals where it has a laxative in the berry. So the animals eat it, they get no nutrient value from it whatsoever. They fly away. It's mostly birds that eat these berries, fly away, and then the laxative takes effect and they drop the buckthorn seed in a new place. Poison ivy berries, the animals eat, and it does have a lot of nutrition for them. And so it's useful in the ecosystem for that reason. But I'm sorry to hear that you're getting it so much.
Can sheep or goats eat buckthorn as a control method?
I haven't really heard of sheep or goats eating buckthorn for control, because it's so woody. I can't imagine an animal grazing on it. I know that people have done sheep and goat controls for sort of more herbaceous plants. With some success. They have to be taught to eat it. They don't like it initially, and they will eat everything else. Like actually goutweed, sheep and goats both can be taught to eat goutweed, but you have to be willing to get rid of everything else first, because they will preferentially eat everything else and then finally come around to the goutweed. I don't know how effective it is long-term. I don't think that I've heard of it being used for woody species like buckthorn.
Thank you. Linda's asking, can you show a photo of bishop's weed? And I'm actually I pulled up the link on the website.
Oh, thank you.
Because I've got bishop's weed, so I just put it in the chat. Okay, gotta go back up now. Is there a strategy to allow certain plants to quote unquote duke it out? For example, grapevines, raspberry/blackberry may discourage Japanese knotweed. I've seen this in my mom's yard in Minnesota.
Yes, that's actually one thing that I've been wondering about grapevine versus bittersweets. And it's something that I sort of am just anecdotally collecting information on myself as I do my field work. One really interesting duke it out circumstance involves parsnip and goldenrod. And it's super cool. Goldenrod, the locally evolved species of goldenrod, seems to be able to outcompete wild parsnip. And it makes sense because goldenrod is one of the locally evolved plants that is actually invasive in other places. It's considered invasive in Europe. But we have like I don't know how many of you make the trek over to Mount Philo, but there's a little meadow in front of the lower parking area at Mount Philo State Park. And the goldenrod is keeping the wild parsnip in check. So it is a strategy in some situations. I think we would want to find more locally evolved plants that could best an invasive plant before we started using it broadly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. This is just a comment. A friend buried the knotweed 8 feet deep and it has not been able to return, someone said.
That's awesome. It has to be that deep. If you bury it 5 feet deep, it can find its way to the surface. So burying is an option, but digging a hole that deep is not work that I'm willing to do. But if it's work that you're willing to do, great, go for it. But make sure it's 8 feet deep.
Susan said, I just read that goutweed is edible. Any lookalikes known? Sorry, that's a sidebar subject, I guess. She says, I've eaten goutweed, so I can attest to this.
How was it?
Not very good.
Oh no.
It's like any green, but it was sort of bitter, which I wasn't in love with. Maybe I should have gotten it when I was younger.
Yeah, a lot of invasive plants are edible. Many of them were actually brought here originally as garden plants. Wild parsnip is the same plant as garden parsnip, just has escaped cultivation and developed this phytophotodermatitis causing toxin that garden parsnip has in lesser concentrations. Garlic mustard is an edible. Dame's rocket is in the same family as garlic mustard. They're all brassicas like broccoli and kale. So it doesn't surprise me to hear that goutweed is edible. I can't think of any lookalikes off the top of my head. But if you go to vtinvasives.org and put goutweed in the search bar, it will pull up a page about goutweed, and there will be side-by-side comparison photos of these are all goutweed photos and these are lookalikes. So if you want to look at the information is there, just not in here.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have an opinion on the knotweed removal process of cut, not mow in June, cut, not mow in July, and then apply glyphosate after flowering and before frost? Specific.
It is. I have never had the time in my job to go back to the same location that many occurrences. So my answer is wholly theoretical. But my understanding is that herbicides tend to work best on plants that are otherwise healthy because those are the ones that are doing the most translocation of nutrients to their roots. And I am very, very, very hesitant to apply herbicides to plants that are in flower. I think that as much as possible, I try to avoid that entirely. So that timeline, although I can understand the logic, is not one that I've ever used, and it's probably not one that I would advocate for. That's my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I understand your rationale in the flowering, but could you just explain to folks why not to do that?
It's to do with pollinators, to minimize their contact exposure, just keeping the herbicides as far away from pollinators as possible. And if you've ever seen a knotweed bush in high summer with the flowers, bees love it. There are so many bees there. And I love bees, so I don't want to spray poisons on them.
Yeah, definitely.
But that would be a circumstance where like maybe cutting it and dripping it, cut it down, put the flowers way over there and then dripping directly into the stem. If the week the knotweed is flowering is the only week that you can get to that patch and you really want to deal with it, then cutting the flowers down, putting them far away, and dripping into the stem would be an option.
Okay, well, I think that was all of our questions. We made it.
Sweet.
Thank you so much for staying
Absolutely.
on.
Can you remind me what I was supposed to send you? I have the video of the uprooter, and then I know there was one other thing, but I forgot.
Yeah, I know the uprooter. Oh, the program that you run where folks monitor
Oh yeah.
the phenology of the plants. That would be great. So if people want to do that, they can. Yeah, those are the two main ones, and we'll send them the website and then also your email if that sounds good to you.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Okay, and I'll send a recording of this event out to anyone who joined us late. Lots of people thanking you in the chat.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Very
Super
helpful.
fun.
It's a challenging topic. Great job. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I learned something every time there's a talk about invasive species. I really do.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm so happy to hear that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye, everyone.